How many times have we heard this story? Dissident journalist arrested to virtual news blackout in his home country. We've heard it quite a bit, I would say, but we haven't heard it about my next guest, and we should. Perhaps you've read the story in the media outlets that are willing to cover it, but they have been, in my view, perhaps he disagrees, too few and far between, and it's a story that must be discussed. The journalist in question is a frequent guest and friend, Max Blumenthal, based here in Washington, D.C., and he's here to talk about that situation with us now to the extent that he can, given that it's an open legal situation. So first of all, Max, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me on, as always. And yeah, I think that it would be spoken about more in mainstream U.S. media or by the sort of free press NGOs if I were to take Russian citizenship and denounce Putin. And maybe if it took place in Russia, then it would be of more importance. There was an American journalist named Corey Weddle who was detained for 12 hours in Venezuela. And, you know, all these groups raised hell about him, but there's been silence about me. On the other hand, you know, I've received so much solidarity and support from, you know, our friends in alternative media and people who really understand what the stakes are, including some people who don't always agree with me. So it hasn't been total radio silence. There's been an outpouring of support and, you know, outrage, justifiably.
Well, and one of the things, I'm actually glad you mentioned people who don't agree with you for this reason. I tracked the case on social media, among other things, and there were people who said, well, you know, Max Blumenthal, I don't like what he has to say about Syria or whatever. And I am strongly of the belief that, you know, I personally respect and trust your reporting. I've been tracking this case on social media, and I have this very strong reaction that when people see a journalist arrested under questionable circumstances and their first reaction is, well, I disagree with him about X, as opposed to, I don't want to live in a country where journalists are arrested under questionable circumstances and it gets virtually no coverage, I think somebody's values are upside down. So, you know, I'm worried not only for you, but I'm worried about what this tells us about our own media landscape, our own political landscape, and I think maybe it would be helpful to talk to the extent that you can about the details of the case so that people have context. But before we do, I have a question. I haven't checked in a couple days, but the first 2 or 3 days after your arrest, I saw nothing about it, for example, in the Washington Post. Have they covered it?
No.
Okay, so question number one, for example, Washington Post is a national newspaper record, right, on the level.
Democracy dies in darkness.
You saw my punchline, but yes, their slogan is democracy dies in darkness, and yet you have the highly charged situation under the most objective of journalistic circumstances of a reporter who has views on the subject of Venezuela and has reported from and about Venezuela being arrested. It strikes me that that's a story. It's also the regional paper for the city of Washington, D.C.
I'm being prosecuted by the federal government for a crime I did not commit.
Okay. And it's getting no coverage. I mean, that's number one, right? Don't you think as a, don't you think as a journalist they should be covering it?
I think as a local paper, they should be covering it partly because it's of interest to so many people internationally. I mean, it's been covered internationally. Mm-hmm. They should at least have the police reporter come down and ask why the DC police, on my warrant, which was executed 5 months after this alleged incident that occurred in the court documents, that was referred to in the court documents, 5 months after, the warrant for my arrest says that I'm armed and dangerous. And, you know, I have a team of DC cops threatening to break my door down, positioning some on the side because they think, what, I'm going to jump out the window or something? I mean, as far as they knew, I was a dangerous armed criminal. And the only people who have that on their arrest warrants, according to the National Crime Information Center, are those who have prior history of homicide or on the run from the law after carrying out a violent crime. That's about 3% of arrest warrants. So why did that happen? I mean, DC police has a lot to answer for. And the Washington Post, as of today, hasn't reached out to me.
Okay, and I want to let's do this. First of all, just tell us as much as you can what happened. You got a knock on the door, or how did you suddenly become aware this was happening?
Yeah. First of all, this is how I see it. I see it as political persecution because a violent, I mean, just they've been documented as violent, a violent right-wing Venezuelan opposition element in Washington, D.C., which attempted to take over the Venezuelan embassy in violation of international law, concocted, invented, fabricated a charge against me, someone who they knew, were very familiar with because of my work exposing their corruption, their violence, and their deceptions around this coup. And they've used the federal government and now local law enforcement as a tool of revenge. And as you said at the beginning, this could happen to anyone because all it took was an accusation for cops 5 months later to show up at my doorstep, threatening to break my door down and to throw me in prison for 2 days. They could just do that against anyone. And because, I believe that because this right-wing putschist element their leadership is being paid by the US government through USAID now, because of their deep connection with the US government, their US proxies, they were taken at their word about me. And because of my position, I mean, you called me a dissident, I would say, I'm a critic of US foreign policy. I'm an opponent of what I see as a US empire. Because I'm, at the margins, they didn't take any effort to investigate the nature of this allegation and to determine whether it was true or not. They just simply took the accuser at their word. And so here we are. That could happen to anyone in our society now. This is a precedent. So I woke up 2 Fridays ago with a banging at my door and saw a team of police officers there. They said that they had a warrant for me for simple assault, which is a misdemeanor. And they said, we just need to get you to court. And I said, what the hell is going on here? Like, what is this? And I ultimately had to negotiate with them in order to get a coat on and be allowed to go to the bathroom in their presence. They got into my living room by threatening to break down my door, and I decided it was best to open the door. And then I was hauled into a paddy wagon, taken to prison. It wasn't just to get me to court, because first they took me to 7D down here in Southeast, because I live down here, and held me there for a while with no ability to call a lawyer. No one in my cell was allowed to call anyone. Then they transported us to central booking to DC Central Jail, threw me in a cell with a guy, a 5x7 cell on a metal slab next to a toilet. That was pretty much the only space in the cell. For 14 hours, again, denied the ability to call a lawyer, along with everybody else. And I spent, because I missed like the cutoff time for being arraigned, I had to spend what basically was 2 days in prison waiting to be brought before a judge to be let go on my own recognizance. And the government apparently wants to take this lie to trial, this lie of simple assault. And it's important to mention that many of the guys I was in jail with who are basically just poor people who are being prosecuted for the crime of being poor, or whatever, not having lawyers. Some of them had simple assault charges, and they were all let go with no paper. In other words, they were just allowed to go home without even having to see a judge, because it's a charge that's always thrown out, always, except in political cases. And so this is a political case, and it appears that the Justice Department wants me to have a trial.
So, and again, we're talking with journalist Max Blumenthal about his recent arrest. So they are now 5 months after the fact asserting that you committed some act of violence, and they treated you in and you've answered some of the questions I had already, but in an extraordinary and unusual way for a case of this nature. Now, just for the context, for people who might not know, the Venezuelan embassy here in Washington, D.C., the United States has backed the assertion of someone who was not elected president, Juan Guaido, who is, I guess, the head of the assembly, that he is the rightful president and that the president who was elected and certified is not. On those grounds, his supporters seized control of the Venezuelan embassy and stopped me at any time if it's wrong. And protesters occupied it on behalf of the constituted government of Venezuela. And now, as I understand it, there had been acts of violence, but that involved, in at least one case, a man of about 70 years old who attempted to deliver food to the anti-Guaido, if you will, people inside the embassy. Is that correct?
There are so many incidents like this. Basically, and you described it well. First of all, this violent right-wing Venezuelan element which appeared outside the embassy, it was very coordinated. It appeared to be coordinated with the U.S. government because they were stage managed by a figure, Carlos Vecchio, who was Guaido's fake ambassador here in D.C. His salary is paid by USAID, and he would appear every night to kind of rile up his troops. And there were other figures I noticed who were directing their activities. A character named Mateo, who came up from North Carolina, a very suspicious character, who was thanked personally on Twitter by Juan Guaido for his role in commanding the whole operation. It was an operation to use terror to flush out the activists who were inside the embassy. Mm-hmm. Sonic terror, strobe lights, violent threats, rape threats, homophobic and racist and sexist rhetoric, and even violence itself. So there were documented incidents of them assaulting people, and the Secret Service, who were on the scene, who work under the auspices of the State Department, which was, pushing regime change in Venezuela, did nothing. If you were there, you were going to be assaulted either verbally or physically if you were on the anti-coup side. And I was there on the anti-coup side, and it was out of control. It was to put it lightly, they made it as unpleasant as possible.
So, and just to interrupt, by the way, Max Blumenthal, I did go down just to take a look. Yeah. And I walked both sides of the street because the two groups were on either side of the street. And so I walked along the Code Pink and other protesters or whatever I don't really know the right term, but the people. And then I walked the perimeter, if you will, of the pro-Guaido, the right-wingers. And I didn't identify myself in any way as belonging to one group or the other. I was wearing jeans and a khaki jacket and a sport coat under it. And I would say there was a palpable sense of violence and threat coming off the right wingers. One of them lunged at me, kind of a fake lunge, and they were sneering. At one point, I did take pictures of both sides, and they were, making nasty gestures. While I'd have to go back and look at my pictures to see what precisely they were doing, but they were being very confrontational and hostile, while I was intentionally attempting to avoid sending any signals of support or opposition at all, just trying to present myself as a neutral party, taking a look, curious, and the sense of threat was palpable.
Yeah, and this is the terror that this element within the Venezuelan opposition that the U.S. backs, which is the most extreme right-wing oligarchic element that centers around the Popular Will or Voluntad Popular Party in Venezuela, is known for in Caracas and other cities in Venezuela, where they've actually burned Chavistas, supporters of the government, alive, and they carried out these violent barricade protests between 2014 and 2017, where many people were killed by them. So this is it's their political culture to be this extreme, and they're completely in bed with the U.S. government. I see them as of a part with a lot of the violent opposition movements the U.S. backs around the world to carry out regime change, and this is the blowback back home. So there was an incident where a activist who is an older man in his 70s named Dean Merville attempted to approach one of their barricades outside the embassy with toothbrushes in his hand to bring toothbrushes to the activist. And he was tackled by these right-wingers, tackled to the ground. Then Secret Service pounced on him, really brutally arrested him, as if he were the culprit and not the people who tackled and attacked him. It just showed how they were on the same side. And then one of the women who helped tackle him comes out on Twitter and says, I'm a pregnant woman, and he attacked a pregnant 29-year-old woman. This is typical of Code Pink tactics. They just lied. And then Carlos Vecchio, Juan Guaido's fake ambassador, takes doctored video of them just showing a small clip of the incident, which still doesn't even match up to what they said it was, and said, here is, our enemies of Code Pink attacking a pregnant woman. So he endorsed this false accusation. So they started to deploy a series of lies because of the bad PR they were getting for their violence and also their fascistic rhetoric that was emanating from their ranks in the heart of a very progressive city. They were offending many local residents by being so loud and just so menacing. And so they just started lying about people on the anti-coup side, including me. The lie was deployed on May 8th at some phony press conference, and 5 months later I was arrested on the basis of this lie, which was never investigated, and for which there is and never will be any basis.
So I have a series of questions for the Washington, D.C. government. And again, we're talking with journalist Max Blumenthal about his recent arrest stemming from the Venezuelan embassy protests of a few months ago. I had a number of questions at the time, and I have more now because of what happened to you. And I want to talk to them about you. First of all, after the incident of this man being attacked for attempting to deliver toothbrushes, that was when I went down, and I spoke to some police officers there. And I'm looking at my notes now because we're journalists, right? I mean, we want to be accurate. I asked the police officers, who are the good guys here? That was my first question. Yeah, they were just, I was just a guy asking, right? And they threw their hands in the air. I said, well, any law breaking go on here? They said, nope, everybody's just exercising their First Amendment rights. I went, oh, well, okay. Nobody's broken the law? And they said, no. I said, any acts of violence or incidents of, body-to-body contact? Anything? Nope, nothing like that. I said, well, who's who? And I pointed to the two groups. He said, well, those guys are with the Venezuelan embassy, meaning the right-wingers, so they had been told that they were legitimate. These guys, I don't know, Russia maybe. And so all of this, even 5-6 months ago, raised some questions in my head. And I was hoping to get a journalistic assignment to pursue them, which I said.
Who did you approach?
We'll talk later. But the questions include this, okay? One would think that the ownership and rightful possession of embassy property has to be determined through some sort of court of international law. Was there a process of international law to determine that Carlos Vecchio was the rightful inhabitant of that property? Do you know?
No, there was a violation of international law to determine him as the rightful owner of the property. There was a obliteration of international law because the Vienna Conventions hold that the government recognized by the UN and its consular facilities shall be respected by a country even if that country is at war with it. So this was an explicit violation of the Vienna Conventions as they relate to consular facilities. The US basically stole it on behalf of Juan Guaido and his gang. And Carlos Vecchio is squatting in the ambassador's residence right now off Massachusetts Ave in Calorama. He's like a squatter.
So that's question number one, which you have answered, which leads us, or me, to question number two, which is what was the nature of the communications between the city of Washington, D.C., which is not an instrument of the State Department, Right? It's not,
Yeah.
although it lacks democratic rights as we understand them elsewhere in the country, it is not part of the foreign policy establishment of the United States. It's a city in the country of the United States of America. Who and by what process was it determined that the municipal power of Washington, D.C. would be deployed on behalf of what is at best a difference of opinion regarding international law and the rightful occupancy of the Venezuelan properties in the United States? Do you know?
Besides the abrogation of international law, there was a subjugation at least, if not a complete abrogation of DC law by the State Department, which was overseeing this entire operation through figures like Elliott Abrams, convicted felon and criminal, in order to...
But to be fair, also a promoter of death squads and torture.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
just
don't know if he was convicted of that.
No, I don't think he was.
That's
but-
just, that's just the American way. But no, they violated DC law on eviction. The Venezuelan embassy, none of the standard protocol for evictions under DC law were followed around the Venezuelan embassy. And even more disturbing than that was how PEPCO, the local electricity utility, was enlisted by the State Department to cut off the electricity to the Venezuelan embassy, even though its electricity bills were fully paid. So you see a local DC utility being instructed by the State Department, by the Trump administration, to cut off electricity in order to advance a U.S. foreign policy regime change imperative.
And they did this through instrumentalities of law. They went to a court and got a court order compelling.
No.
A rhetorical question, I think, but
Yeah.
I can't see, Max Blumenthal. This all to me ties with your arrest too. My way of like unpacking, to the extent that I can, the use of global force and global power in the pursuit of conflict, how that translates even mechanically to how, in a country that most of us consider to be non-totalitarian, right? How somebody actually calls up PEPCO, the power company, calls up the DC police force, calls up whoever else needs to be called up and says, you know what? You may think you're the district attorney, or you may think you run a little power company there, or you may think whatever you think, you may think you're the chief of police, but here's what you're going to do, and it's because I'm saying so.
Yep. I mean, and that's the way the U.S. acts on the global stage. But again, as I said, this is blowback. The lawlessness and roguishness of U.S. regime change policy came home through all these incidents, and the mask was kind of lifted. The veil of democracy was lifted through this standoff around the Venezuelan embassy, and it continues to play out with my arrest and what appears to be a prosecution based on a complete lie.
So the next question I would have, again, and I'm sorry to be so granular, Max Blumenthal, but I really think sometimes the big reality comes out in the little grains of information. And so the next question I would have is, look, I've never done the police beat, right? And I've certainly never done the police beat in Washington, D.C. But the next question, which I think you've already answered, is it or not unusual for a misdemeanor charge of this kind to be brought 5 months after the alleged event, number one. Number two, is it unusual or not to simply like subpoena the guy or whatever, or say, listen, you need to make a court appearance. Number three, how did I have a million questions, but the procedural to me is almost the key to the extremity of the measures being taken here. Do you know what I'm trying to say? I don't know if I'm putting that well.
Everyone I've spoken to, from the corrections officers in jail to the lawyers I've been speaking to, including lawyers who've, done murder trials for decades, said that they've never heard of an incident like this. Specifically, where 5 months after an alleged incident, which is a supposed misdemeanor, there is an arrest, and their arrest is carried out this way.
So one of the dimensions of this case, the Max Blumenthal case, for lack of a better name, is for residents of Washington, D.C. I think I just moved out 6 months ago, or a couple of years ago, but if I were still a resident in Washington, D.C., I would be saying, I would want to know right now that the municipal institutions that govern me, the city council that I vote for, the mayor that I vote for, who are supposed to be in charge of that, have been redirected under extrajudicial procedures, and I want to know more. And I want to know why my city isn't functioning as an American city is, we're told, should function. Number one. Number two, as an American, and I'm sorry to speechify, and I'll stop in a second, but number two, I continue to want to know, as an American citizen, by what means, through what channels of communication, and upon whose orders were all of these actions taken, beginning with the reallocation, if you will, the seizure and reallocation of Venezuelan physical property, to the unusual lack of enforcement during the demonstrations, to what appears to me to be a set of instructions and false information given to the police who were assigned to manage that, all the way leading up to 2 weeks ago and your arrest. I want to know, as an American citizen, how this happened, who made the decisions, and why the hell the people who claim to be doing journalistic work on my behalf and tell me that democracy dies in darkness have not shown a light on this. And I'm done giving my speech.
Yeah. Great speech. Why did the Washington Post, which was supposed to be covering this embassy standoff, not raise any of these questions about the subordination of D.C. law and D.C. government institutions by the State Department to advance the priorities of U.S. foreign policy, and specifically a rogue regime change operation? How could that be possible? And of course, there's so many problems with the way our city government functions, and there's so much obvious corruption with the government being, legal corruption being bought off by rich developers, that many people aren't able to ask these questions. But the Washington Post was covering this incident, never raised any of these pertinent questions. And now, of course, they're not covering, at least at this point, they haven't covered my prosecution. And there are questions there. For example, according to someone I know who's familiar with all of the court documents, a judge did reject the warrant initially for my arrest. Why was it reauthorized? When was it reauthorized? And who applied pressure in order to get it authorized? Was it the State Department applying pressure? Was it members of the right-wing Venezuelan opposition? And this speaks to the level of collaboration between all of these elements to use ultimately local police as a tool of revenge against a journalist who has been at the forefront of critical reporting and investigative reporting on this right-wing coup and the administration behind it, using completely false charges that were never investigated by the DC government. Those questions should be raised because they don't just apply to me, they apply to so many others who can and will face the same treatment, because all it takes, apparently, is an allegation by a random person or a group of people who don't like a certain journalist for the DC police to be called in to arrest them at home and for the federal government to prosecute them.
So one of the things, as a journalist, Max Blumenthal, one of the things that comes to mind for me is we saw an escalation under the George W. Bush administration of national security, invasive espionage, electronic and otherwise. We saw an increase in the number of whistleblower prosecutions, which skyrocketed during the Obama administration to unprecedented levels. Many people still don't realize how intensely the Obama administration pursued people who are trying to bring the truth to the American people. And that goes on. and under Trump. Not as intensely, frankly, as it did under Obama, as the statistics show, but quite intensely. Now, do you get the sense that your own arrest represents the next escalation of this, which is not just if you're a whistleblower, not just if you're a James Risen of the New York Times getting whistleblower information, but or a Julian Assange or whomever, that now it becomes a matter of journalists who investigate certain things or challenge certain things are actually, at least in the city of Washington, D.C., subject to the kind of thing you went through?
Well, there aren't many journalists doing the kind of work that I and my colleagues have been doing in the U.S. who get recognition. I mean, I would say you're one of them, but there aren't many of us. And so there isn't, it's an interesting test case. What I think this represents is the dawn of a new series of tactics, the introduction of a new series of tactics that will be used against journalists who are considered threatening for whatever reason to the dominant agenda, the dominant foreign policy agenda. I mean, when you really start interfering with the bipartisan foreign policy consensus in Washington, you realize that you're touching a third rail. It's not like you're participating in the abortion debate, which is part of the culture war, and one party sides with you and the other party is hates what you're doing. You're hitting kind of the heart of American empire and what many people in Washington think America is supposed to stand for on the world stage. And that's very threatening. Now, in other countries, we constantly hear about this from the free press NGOs and the human rights group, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and even our own State Department. Governments and their allies, and specifically their allies, use legal intimidation, phony lawsuits, and bogus arrests, and they against their opponents in the media. So you can see it maybe in the Philippines with someone like Maria Ressa, who runs a site called Rappler, which is funded by the same guy who funds The Intercept, Piero Midyar, and who's very U.S. aligned, but who is also considered a person of great integrity in the Philippines by the opposition to Duterte. In Turkey, Erdogan and his AKP party don't just arrest more journalists than any other country in the world, his government. They will have allies, wealthy allies, buy up media outlets that were opposition outlets and turn them into pro-government outlets. They will also use tactics, lawsuits, and phony allegations against journalists. It happens a lot in Israel as well. And the right-wing Israeli government and its allies have tried to relax libel laws. And so that's what's happening with me. This is part of a wider campaign of legal intimidation and just intimidation in general. And you can see it on Twitter with the denigration of me and my colleagues at the Gray Zone. But this is part of a wider campaign that I'll be talking about more. This is pretty much all I can say right now, but it's actually more troubling than I've even described. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be carried out by Donald Trump in the Oval Office in his evil Trump cave. It can be done in a very atomized fashion, but there is an operation that has been attempting to silence me and my outlet for years, and there's been a constant escalation. So in this case, you have an element that we've been reporting on critically, leveling false allegations and using law enforcement as a tool of revenge. And that could happen to anyone.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but Max Blumenthal, we will be following closely, and anytime you want to come back and update us, you're more than welcome. Anytime you want to update us on the broader story and the broader effort, you're welcome to come back and discuss that too. In the meantime, best of luck.
Thank you, RJ.